Muirchertach mac Urca, according to medieval Irish tradition, stands among the most striking figures of the early 6th century. Genealogies place him among the descendants of Niall of the 9 hostages through Muirchertach and Ogan, and later storytellers came to remember him as the earliest ruler of Ireland who favored Christianity. His supposed reign is usually set in the decades after 510, extending into the mid-535s. Within legend, he appears as a conqueror of remarkable scale, waging war across Ireland and beyond, levying tribute, claiming the inauguration stone of kingship, extending his command into Gaul, Britain, Scotland, the lands of the Saxons, Denmark, and the Northern Islands. His early career is painted as ruthless, yet he ends as a figure marked by the heroic triple death, a motif associated with the greatest warriors of Celtic story. The parallels with the later tales of Arthur have long been noted. 2 rulers placed in the same era, credited with victories across neighboring lands, celebrated in battle, and honored with mythic endings. His fame survives in a wide range of old Irish compilations. Manuscripts such as the Yellow Book of Lecan, the Irish Annals, the Dinsanchas, the Banchanchus, the Book of Leinster, the Laud Synchronisms, the Banquet of Dunnanged, and the Book of Ballymote preserve fragments of his deeds, though their content often draws upon sources older than the manuscripts themselves. A lost narrative known as the Voyages of Muirchertach mac Urca is said to have described his campaign in Gaul, and early poetry, credited to Firelit, celebrates his victories. His violent passing is the subject of Aided Muirchertach, which presents the dramatic circumstances surrounding his final day. A notable Irish rendering of the Historia Brittonum includes an account titled The Miracles of Camelot, where Mac Urca appears not only as High King of Ireland, but also as a warrior who defeats the British ruler Luarig, and then overcomes Franks, Saxons, Picts, and Britons. Scholars recognize this narrative as a blending of several traditions: ecclesiastical material about the Saint Camelot, heroic lore concerning Mac Urca, and later genealogies, all combined into a single tale. The compiler placed these events shortly after the Roman withdrawal from Britain, suggesting a frame stretching from the early 5th century toward the middle of the 6th. Earlier references to Mac Urca in poetic tradition show that some of the elements may derive from material circulating centuries before the text we now have. Several features of the Camelot narrative hint at the period in which different layers were shaped. The Danish and Viking peoples are entirely absent, pointing to a time before their arrival on Irish shores. The Kingdom of Alba is portrayed in a way that fits the era when the Cenél Lorne exerted strong influence in western Scotland, rather than the later dominance of the Cenél Gabhran, or the later unification of the whole region under one crown. Internal details suggest that certain strands could have been formed in the 7th or 8th century, while others reflect political ideas known in the 10th and 11th. 2 genealogical sequences are embedded in the story. One line makes Muirchertach the son of Muirchertach, with Eric presented as his mother, a reinterpretation believed to have arisen in later centuries. A second tradition describes him seizing the wife of Luarig, who is portrayed as daughter of the Frankish ruler, said to bear Mac Urca several sons. Among them appears Constantine, who in these accounts becomes forefather of British kings. This is remarkable, for it implies that the Constantine remembered by British tradition might descend from an Irish dynastic line linked to Mac Urca. Later medieval British lore, especially in the age of Arthurian romance, likewise names a Constantine who follows Arthur as ruler. In this way, the legends surrounding Muirchertach mac Urca form a tapestry woven from saintly biography, heroic saga, classical-style conquest narrative, and the shifting ambitions of Irish and Scottish dynasties. Though history and folklore blur into one another, the tradition reveals how medieval writers pictured a king who stood alongside the greatest champions of Britain and Ireland, a lord of battles, ancestor of rulers, victor in distant lands, and a figure whose story continued to evolve for centuries after his death. The second son in this genealogy, Geidhil Ficht, is portrayed as an ancestral figure for a kind of Irish Pict group who supposedly ruled an independent Cornwall. This idea fits comfortably with what is known about strong Irish connections with the southwest of Britain in the early Middle Ages. Anglo-Saxon control did not reach fully into Cornwall until the early 9th century, when Ecgbert of Wessex imposed overlordship and turned the region into a subordinated principality. That political horizon means this strand of the story most naturally reflects a world of the later 8th century, when Cornish independence still made sense and kings of Cornwall could still be imagined as real players. The third son, Nellan, is claimed as the ancestor of the northern Uí Né, while the fourth, Scannell, is presented as the founding figure for the Eoganachta of the south. The Eoganachta dominated much of southern Ireland from the 7th to the 10th century, and the name Scannell appears as an important family branch in the 11th century. The annals record that in 1014, at the Battle of Clontarf, Eocha, son of Dunadbach, chief of Clan Scannell, and Scannell, son of Cathal, lord of Eoganacht Locha Lane, were both killed. Whether this coincidence of name and status influenced the shaping of the saga is uncertain, but it underlines how fully these genealogies reflect later political realities rather than secure early history. Taken together, such descent claims must be treated as legendary constructions. When the stories are peeled back, the only relatively firm testimony about mac Urca's family comes from a 7th century church writer who states that his father was Muirchertach and that he had 3 sons named Baitan, Domnall, and Forcas. Whether that Muirchertach was truly the son of Eogan, son of Niall, and thus part of the Uí Néill line, cannot be proved. It is clear, however, that by the later 8th and 9th centuries, the Uí Néill had begun to promote a version of their own pedigree that merged their ancestor Muirchertach with the figure of mac Urca. The narrative known in English as the Miracles of Caernach is therefore best understood as a patchwork assembled over several centuries and preserved in the Book of Ballymote. Its oldest layers appear to belong to the 7th century and include the brief notices about mac Urca's father and sons and about his defeat of Lugaid or Luirig. A second group of material adds his campaigns against the Franks, Saxons, Britons, and the people of the Orkneys, and probably belongs to the 8th or 9th century, when Irish writers were thinking about conflicts with continental powers and Northern Islanders, and when terms like Alba were beginning to be used more broadly for parts of Scotland. In the same broad period, the story seems to have acquired the genealogical passages about defeating a Frankish ruler and fathering Constantine, Geidhil Ficht, Nellan, and Scannell. The version that has survived was shaped later, after the 10th century, when the name mac Urca had come to be interpreted as a son of Urc, in a specifically maternal sense, and when Alba could be used to refer to the whole of Pictland and Argyll. Much of what is said about Muirchertach's conquests, his mythical descendants, and his dominion over distant regions most likely reflects the ambitions and imagination of the 8th century, before Viking raids began in 795. At a time when Cornwall still held its own rulers, the Eoganachta remained influential in the south, and the Uí Néill had established their lasting dominance in the north. A different but related strand of the tradition about Mac Urca's end appears in the Yellow Book of Lecan, a 15th century compilation drawing on earlier 14th and 15th century manuscripts, themselves ultimately dependent on older textual sources. Among its many mythological and heroic narratives is Aided Muirchertach Mac Urca, the tale of Muirchertach Mac Urca's violent death. This story is generally thought to have been first composed in the 10th or 11th century, using older material to flesh out Mac Urca's deeds, and perhaps drawing on the same reservoir of stories that underpinned the Cairnach narrative and the now-lost Ectra Muirchertach. The tale survives today in several later copies, in Dublin and Royal Irish Academy collections, but it was already known in earlier Irish texts between the 9th and the 11th centuries, where it is mentioned by title. In its present form, the story still reflects an older religious imagination, for hell is pictured as a place of intense cold, a vision that belongs to an age before the fully developed doctrine of purgatory altered Western views of the afterlife. The original composition may have followed the death of Muirchertach of the Uí Néill in 943, who is styled in the annals as something like a Hector of the Western world. In the Aided story, Mac Urca receives a similar grand epithet as High King of the Western world, which suggests that the historical ruler's reputation influenced the shaping of the legendary king. The triple death of Mac Urca at Clitec is also recalled in a poem by Cyned Ua Hartacayan, who died in 975, further pointing to a 10th century context for the basic outline. The story's language preserves older forms such as boined for the river Boyne, a usage that had almost vanished by around the year 1000 and so cannot be very late. At the same time, the narrative refers to a group called the Danaraib, often equated with Danes. The word Danair appears in the Irish annals only towards the end of the 10th century, in entries between 986 and 990, though it may have been in use somewhat earlier. These people may have been Scandinavians operating from Orkney, and their inclusion in the tale may reflect a later updating of Mac Urca's story at a time when such settlers were prominent in the northern seas. In the narrative, he only rules over them briefly for 2 years, which recalls the fleeting mention of similar groups in contemporary annalistic entries. The political balance portrayed in the Aided provides a further clue to its date. The story accords equal standing to both major northern branches of the Uí Néill, the Ceannail Conail and Ceannail Eogain. This is striking because by the 9th century, the power of the Ceannail Conail had largely been eclipsed by that of the Ceannail Eogain. There was, however, a short interval in the mid-10th century when families descended from the Ceannail Conail, notably the Uamail Dored and Ua Cananayan dynasties, once again rose to prominence. After the deaths of Muirchertach of the Uí Néill in 943, and Donchad Don in 944, whose daughter had married into that circle, Raedri Ua Cananain took power and may have held the position of High King of Ireland until his death in 950. It seems highly likely that the core of the Aided story was first shaped in that brief period of Senel Conail resurgence, when a narrative that gave them parity with their Senel Eogan rivals would have been politically attractive. In the following generations, the Senel Eogan reasserted dominance under Domnall Ui Nail, and Senel Conail authority faded for good. The tale of Mac Urca's death was then reworked, expanded, and embellished in the 11th century and later. Modern study of the text suggests that its earliest form had a strong folkloric character, with later layers adding more explicit Christian teaching and moralization. Over time, the account downplays the full force of the threefold death, eventually removing the detail of the spear wounding from some branches of the tradition. At its heart, the story remains a supernatural narrative about the otherworld woman Sin, whose name is pronounced roughly like Sheen, and her attempt to seduce and destroy the king of Tara. The pattern of his triple death is not unique in Irish lore. Similar fates are attributed to other kings, such as Cormac MacAirt, Diarmait MacSirbile, and Aed Dub. Scholars have often noted that such threefold deaths appear to preserve a very old Indo-European motif. Arthur's fate, as it developed in later British tradition, echoes this structure. He is wounded, associated with water through the casting away of his sword, yet avoids a final fiery end. In both Arthur's story and that of Mac Urca, the older pagan pattern of a threefold death is softened or broken as Christian themes reshape the material. A later English poet, writing a versified history of Britain in the early 13th century, seems to echo this Irish pattern in a dream vision of Arthur turning upon the wheel of fortune. As if he knew and creatively reworked elements of the older triple death symbolism. The modern English version of Aided Muirchertach Mic Airca that underlies this retelling builds on an earlier translation, which focused mainly on the prose narrative and left out many of the embedded verses. Those verses, however, often preserve extra detail and nuance that the prose alone does not convey. Later work has therefore drawn on a French rendering of the whole tale, supplemented by detailed lexical study of Old Irish and the expertise of specialists in the language to recover and translate the poetic sections alongside the story. The result is a more complete English presentation of Mac Urca's death, in which both prose and verse are brought together to reflect more fully the richness of the surviving tradition. Mac Urca's family background is tangled and artificial in a way that resembles the tradition around Arthur, but with even more layers. In the Arthurian story, Uther uses magic to take on the likeness of Gorlois, husband of Igraine. He sleeps with Igraine while disguised, Arthur is conceived from that union, and Uther later kills Gorlois and marries her. In other words, Arthur's father seizes another man's wife by deception and force. Irish narrative gives Mac Urca a very similar pattern, but without the need for sorcery. His father simply runs away with the Princess Urc, who had been promised in marriage to the King of Britain. Irish tradition then offers different explanations for Mac Urca's own name. One line claims that his mother was called Urc, daughter of Lorn, ruler in Alba, that is, Argyll in western Scotland. Another interpretation connects the name Urc with a bishop of Slane, also called Urc, a follower of Patrick, whose name later appears in Cornwall in the form Earth. In Welsh, earth can be related to a word for bear, which brings it close in meaning to Arth, the root behind Arthur. In one manuscript of the Irish Annals, His name at his death is written Erta, almost certainly an error by a scribe rather than a genuine form. The portrayal of him as son of a woman named Urk seems to be a creation of the 10th or 11th century, when Muirchertach began to be read as a metronymic rather than a simple patronymic. The personal name Muirchertach, however, appears in several regions of early Ireland. There are Muirchertachs in Munster, in Connaught, where one line is praised as strong and steadfast, and even inscriptions suggest individuals with the same name in places such as Anglesey. The father of our Muirchertach is presented as Muirchertach, who died around the end of the 5th century, and is made a grandson of Niall of the 9 Hostages, a ruler whose own death is placed around the middle of that century. Muirchertach is sometimes described as having both Irish and Saxon blood, and the tale tells how he eloped with the Irish princess Eirc, daughter of Lorne of Argyll. Eirc had originally been destined to marry Saran, a legendary king with authority in Britain and Ireland, and so Saran instead took her sister Babona as his wife. From the union of Eirc and Muirchertach came Muirchertach, Feradach, Tigernach, and Mayan. After Muirchertach's death, Eirc is said to have married Fergus, son of Conall Gulban, giving birth to Sedna, Fedlamid, Brendan, and another Lorne. Fedlamid becomes the father of Columba, founder of the monastery on Iona. The result is a web of half-brothers, uncles, and cousins that puts Muirchertach at the center of a dense network of kinship. One clear purpose of this construction is to link him by blood to more than one branch of the Ui Né, especially the Senel Conai and Senel Eogan. In the 6th century, it was the Senel Conai who often held the stronger position. Later genealogical layers extend this strategy by projecting Muirchertach's descendants across Britain and beyond. From his first wife, one son, Bédan, is made the ancestor of a line that eventually produces kings in Saxon Northumbria, including Aldfrith. At a more obviously legendary level, a second wife is introduced, described as a daughter of the Frankish king Clovis. Through this union, Muirchertach is credited with fathering Constantine, identified with the figure condemned by the British writer Gildas, and thus becomes the imagined forefather of later kings of the Britons. The narrative clearly aims to place his seed on the thrones of Ireland, Scotland, Britain, and the Frankish realm in one sweep, a strategy that mirrors the way Geoffrey of Monmouth later spreads Arthur's influence over much of Western Europe. The second marriage allows writers to assign to Muirchertach not only Constantine, but also Gædil Ficht, an Irish Picts ancestor in Cornwall, Nellan, who becomes the root of the northern Ui Nail, and Scannell, progenitor of southern lines associated with the Eoganachta, the ruling dynasty of much of southern Ireland between the 7th and 10th centuries. We can see how flexible and political this genealogical imagination is. The name Eirc or Eircha itself is rich in meaning. Early glossaries explain it as sky or heaven, so the compound Muirchertach can be read as son of the sky or son of heaven, which naturally suggests a star. Some scholars have compared Eircha to the Sanskrit word arka, meaning ray or sun or star, and have noticed possible links to words for bear in related languages, such as Greek Arctos and Latin Ursus. This in turn evokes the bright star Arcturus in the constellation Bootes, often associated with bear imagery. Another strand of Irish lexical tradition gives Eirc the sense of red or speckled, so Muirchertach could be understood as a name evoking a red or shining celestial body. One leading authority on Ogham inscriptions, noted that Urca appears frequently as a female name in legendary materials, and suggested that it may once have been an epithet for a divine figure. The abundance of personal names of the form Mac Urcs or Maci Urchius has led to the idea that these people styled themselves as sons, or perhaps devotees of a protective goddess. It is therefore possible that Mac Urca originally meant son of the bear goddess, or child of Ursus. In Greek myth, Arcas, son of the bear mother who is elevated to the heavens, is set in the sky as the figure of Bootes to prevent him from killing his own mother. Over time, Arcas, Ursus, and Arcturus become closely intertwined in late antique and early medieval star lore. Bootes stands near the constellation Draco, the dragon, a creature later bound to Arthur's family through the epithet Pendragon. Modern analysis has explored at length how Arcas and Arcturus feed into Arthurian associations. The association of Mac Urca with a star is echoed in a verse near the end of the tale of his death, where an angelic voice addresses him as having gone into the sky, speaks of him as eternally above, and describes him with the brightness one would normally ascribe to a star, even while linking his fate to punishment in the next world. The language recalls Latin panegyrics that likened prominent Romans to stars in the firmament. As Arcturus never sinks below the horizon in certain latitudes, it is easy to see why the poem describes Mac Urca as forever on high. Medieval writers also regularly used the form Arcturus as a Latinized version of Arthur, and the sequence Arcturus to Arthurus. To Arthur shows how naturally one name could yield the other. Urc as a word carried many different nuances in Goidelic speech, and several of them can be brought into dialogue with the later development of Arthurian motifs. In Welsh, related forms such as erc or irc could mean terrible or dreadful. A gloss from a Northern English manuscript connects Arthur's name with a phrase meaning fearsome son, explaining that he was ruthless from youth and that the name can be understood as terrible bear or iron hammer. The name Uther is itself often taken to mean dread or terrible, and a phrase such as Mab Uther, son of Uther, could be heard as parallel to Mac Urca for listeners familiar with both Brittonic and Goidelic. Mac Urca's wife is named in Irish sources as Duinsech or Dwibsech, literally something like dark-haired girl. A plausible Welsh form of that name would draw close to Gwynauverch, a shape strikingly similar to the later Guinevere. The given name Muirchertach also demands attention. It breaks down into Muir, meaning sea or from overseas, and a second element, Certach or Certach. The simple word cert in Irish means right or proper, but it usually appears at the start of compounds, not at the end, so this may not be the best guide. The form Certach looks very much like an Irish adaptation of Brittonic and Latin names, such as Ceredig, Careticus, or Coroticus, all of which come from a root meaning loved or dear, and are related to names like Caraticus and Irish Carthach or Carther, from which later surnames such as McCarthy and MacArthur arise. In later texts, Muirchertach also appears as Muirchertach, which supports the connection with this family of names. The full meaning could therefore be something like sea beloved or sea friend. Modern studies of Irish surname origins tend to gloss it along the lines of skilled in seafaring or mariner, which fits this interpretation. Another possibility is raised by an old Irish law gloss that defines a term Muirchertach or Muirchertha as a foreigner washed up from overseas, especially a Briton. That word is linked to the status of strangers and wanderers from across the sea. The proximity of Muirchertach to such terms suggests that the name might have carried echoes of an overseas origin or a foreign connection. In English, the name eventually developed into forms such as Moriarty. Trying to prove that a historical Muirchertach mac Urca existed as described in legend is difficult when we rely only on the surviving Irish manuscripts and king lists. A mac Ursain is listed as an early 6th century ruler in a late 7th century catalogue of kings, Baile Shuin Chechataig. But it is not certain that this figure is really the same as the later Muirchertach mac Muiradaig, even though later tales merge them. Poems attributed to Chen Fialad, a 7th century poet and reputed descendant of mac Urca, show that exploits under that name were already circulating by his time, so the legendary king was not a late invention. The combination Muirchertach mac Urca seems to be the product of Uí Néill genealogical work in the 8th and 9th centuries when they were reshaping the past to bolster their claims. From the 9th century onwards, the name Muirchertach is attested in the Irish annals as that of living kings, which indicates that his reputation had become strong enough that later rulers wanted to echo it for their own sons. The full form, Muirchertach mac Urca, first appears in a king list embedded in the prophetic narrative known as Baile in Scale, the Frenzy of the Phantom, which was compiled between the 9th and the 11th century. Here he is counted among the Uí Néill high kings of the 6th century, occupying the position held earlier by mac Ursain. Baile in Scale survives in later manuscripts, but its core list of kings was worked over in favor of the Uí Néill and based on the older Baile Chuin list. That sequence originally ended with Congal Tenmager, who died around 710, and was then extended in stages up to the 11th century. In one round of revision, an abbot of Armagh is known to have adjusted it to serve Uí Néill interests more clearly. Within this reshaped list, Muirchertach is given as the son of a daughter of Lorn, cementing his connection to Argyll, and his death at Clytech is noted, tying the cold facts of a king list to the elaborate story of his triple end in heroic saga. The earliest surviving forms of the name mac Urca appear on ogham stones in both Wales and Ireland, carved in the 5th and 6th centuries. On these monuments, the name shows up in forms such as Maci Ercagni and Maci Erchias. This matches the oldest manuscript form in the 7th century king list, Baile Chuin, which uses the diminutive mac Erchene. Another ogham form of Urca is known, but it may be as late as the 8th century, and is less useful for reconstructing the earliest stage of the name. The diminutive Ersain in Baile Chuin is an old and uncommon formation in early Irish, which strongly suggests that the entry preserves a genuine early tradition rather than a later invention. The ogham form, Maci Erchias, a feminine genitive, is almost certainly the shape that later produced mac Urche and then mac Urcha. The ending, ias, is a typical feminine genitive ending in this period. A corresponding masculine genitive would be reconstructed as Urcas. An important ogham inscription shows both male and female forms together. Urc, son of mac Urs, of the people of Dubon, from a stone in County Kerry. This single inscription demonstrates that Urki could be a male personal name, while Urchias or Ursi functioned as a related female or divine name. By the later 7th century, church writers were using the form mac Urs in Latin, Lives of Saints. The Life of Columba by Adamnan refers to him under this name. The authors of early lives of Patrick also employed the form Erse. In the Irish annals, the earliest spellings appear as Erse, with Erca and Erkai emerging later as spelling developments of the middle of the 8th century and after. The likely sequence of forms is Erchias giving Erche, then Erche, and finally Erca. This pattern points to an annalistic exemplar from the mid-7th to early 8th century, or to entries written in that period and later copied, rather than much earlier record-keeping. At some point, the Uí Néill dynasty began to associate a somewhat obscure genealogical figure, Muirchertach mac Muircheartaigh, with the earlier king mac Eirtsen, who appears in the Baile Chuin list and in Adamnan's work as mac Eirche. In the Life of Columba, Adamnan describes a battle in which Domnall and Forcas, sons of mac Urs, fight and win. This clash, known as the Battle of Cúl Dreimhne, appears in the Annals of Ulster under the year 560 or 561. The original entry in the Annals seems to have mentioned only mac Erke. At a later stage, the name Muirchertach was added to that notice. The form of the entry and the spelling of the name indicate that the first annalistic version was probably written in the late 8th century, with the explicit mention of Muirchertach added in the 9th century or afterwards. From that point on, king lists, annals, and narrative texts influenced by Uí Néill, perspectives increasingly referred to Muirchertach mac Erca. Explaining exactly how Muirchertach mac Muircheartaigh became fused with mac Eirtsen is not straightforward. Several modern historians have argued that the merger was part of an 8th to 9th century Uí Néill strategy to bind an older remembered king to the Ceannail Éogan branch, strengthening their pedigree. The question then arises, who was the original mac Erca before this rearrangement? Adamnan, writing at the end of the 7th century, twice mentions mac Erts. One passage speaks of Domnall and Forcas, sons of mac Erts, fighting alongside Einmere, son of Setna. Another prediction describes Baitan, son of mac Erch, and Eochu, son of Domnall, as descendants of Muirchertach, suggesting that mac Eirtse himself was linked to a Muirchertach who stood at the root of a major Ceannail Éogan line. In Adamnan's own milieu, the sons of mac Eirtse appear to have seen themselves as descendants of Muirchertach mac Éogan mac Néill. At that stage, there is no sign of a separate group calling themselves Ceannail mac Erke. Evidence from the guarantor list of Adamnan's law supports this impression. When the leading kindreds and dynasties agreeing to the law are named, branches such as Ceannail Conail and Ceannail Feradeg of Ceannail Éogain are listed, but no Ceannail mac Erke appears. A distinct race of mac Erke had not yet been created in naming or political terms. In the early 8th century, the power of the Ceannail Feradeg declined sharply, and the broader Ceannail Éogan began to recast their own identity. After a decisive defeat of the Ceannail Conail in 789 at the Battle of Cloytech, the Ceannail Éogan rulers reshaped their northern Uí Néill kingship, redefining their territory as the Kingdom of Ailech and reworking their ancestral line. In this context, it appears that the genealogists merged Muirchertach mac Muircheartaigh with the older king mac Eirtsen, thereby inventing a more prestigious ancestor, Muirchertach mac Erca, stripped of the Muircheartaigh label and endowed with heroic credentials. This revised figure then appears in the later king list of Baile in Skyle, compiled between the 9th and 11th centuries, where he is firmly named Muirchertach mac Erca, among the high kings of the 6th century. His sons Domnall and Fergus are likewise elevated and treated as high kings of Tara in this later scheme, even though they had not appeared as such in the earlier Bail Chuin list, and were more probably kings of Ailech alone. The reshaped genealogy therefore binds together two once separate people: a 6th century king called Mac Ersen, about whom only a few sparse details are known, and a genealogical ancestor named Muirchertach Mac Muircheartaigh, whose own life is otherwise barely recorded. The resulting composite, Muirchertach Mac Urca, then becomes the focus of expanded saga traditions. The annalistic records for his military activity are best approached through the oldest surviving Irish chronicle manuscript, the 11th century Annals of Innisfallen, produced in Munster. These entries, written in Latin and free from later Northern Uí Néill editing, consistently use the form Mac Ers, and so preserve a relatively early stage of the tradition. When compared with the Annals of Ulster, which diverged from the common Iona Chronicle in the mid-8th century, the Innisfallen entries help to identify which battles can confidently be associated with Mac Ers and which are likely to be later additions. The campaigns that look most securely tied to him are Granerd in 486, Inimore around 500, Segais around 502, Ten Eich and Ath Saig around 530, and Eblin around 532. When related engagements mentioned elsewhere, such as Delg, Mukrema, and Tuaim Druba in 500, and Mag Ailba, Aidna, and Almuain in 532, are grouped with these main encounters. The total comes to 12 campaigns. This number invites comparison with the 12 battles later attributed to Arthur against the Saxons. Where the Annals of Ulster retain the older spelling Ers, they generally line up with the Innisfallen list of battles. One Innisfallen entry for 530 credits, Ath Saig to Muirchertach, and Ken Eich to Mac Ersh, as if they were distinct individuals. The corresponding entry in the Ulster Annals treats the victories as belonging to a single figure, suggesting that the split in Innisfallen may be the result of scribal confusion. Some battles that appear under Mac Urca's name in Northern Chronicles are more suspect. Ocha in 484, Sel Osnada in 489, and Detnai in 520 show signs of having been later attached to his dossier. The Battle of Granerd in 486 has also been debated. In the Annals of Ulster, the battle is first credited to Corpre MacNeill, with Mac Ers mentioned in a way that some readers interpret as secondary. However, Innisfallen gives the victory first and clearly to Mac Ers, then adds that some attribute the success to Cairpre. The Ulster entry also uses a spelling of the place name and a formula for son of Ers that are typical of 9th century and later writing. This combination makes it more plausible that the Coirpre attribution is a later northern reworking, while Mac Ertz's credit in Innisfallen is closer to the older tradition. Alternative suggestions have been made that some early battles in 500 and 502 belonged to a different Mac Urca, namely the son of Ailil Molt. That proposal is difficult to sustain. The Mac Urca in question dies in 548, according to the Annals, and is consistently labeled as son of Ailil Molt in those entries. It is unlikely that he would have been leading campaigns as early as 500. The pattern that emerges instead leaves the main cluster of battles between roughly 486 and 502, followed by a long gap until around 530. Remarkably, This almost 30-year silence in Irish campaigns coincides with the very period when later verse places Muirchertach overseas in Britain, leading the hosts of both Britons and Saxons. The record of his death raises further questions. The annals of Innisfallen, which preserve his battles, make no mention of his demise. The earliest surviving notice of his death appears in the Annals of Ulster under 534, where the entry is in Latin and uses the form Muirchertach, son of Eircham. This notice also inserts his constructed genealogy, linking him to Muirchertach, Eogan, and Niall of the 9 hostages, and describes his drowning in a vat of wine at the fortress of Claytech, above the Boyne. The use of firelit instead of the regular mac or mic, together with the expanded genealogical note, suggests a relatively late composition of this entry, consistent with the period when the composite figure Muirchertach mac Urca had already been fully developed. A second notice under 536 repeats his death and appears to align with the festival of Samhain, the time at which later legend places his triple end. That second notice likely reflects post-10th century adjustments shaped by saga tradition. The earlier 534 entry preserves the older spelling Urs, but is still clearly influenced by the later genealogical synthesis. None of the Irish chronicle traditions independent of the Ulster compilation say anything about the exact date or circumstances of his death. Taking all of this together, a continuous story of Muirchertach mac Urca's life and death can be pieced together from scattered references. Chronicles, saints' lives, genealogical tracts, and heroic tales each conserve a fragment of his legend or memory. One substantial portion of the material comes from the narrative often called of the Miracles of Cairnach, which provides the backbone for his campaigns and dealings with Britain, Gaul, and the Northern world. A second major section is the violent death of Muirchertach mac Urca in the Yellow Book of Lacan, which supplies the detailed account of his final days, his otherworldly temptress, and his triple death at Claytech. The battle notices and accompanying verses in the Irish and Scottish annals help to anchor this narrative in a rough chronological frame, even though the dates themselves are the product of later synchronizing work and must be handled with care. The resulting narrative unfolds across Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Northern Britain. In Ireland, the chief stages are in Donegal, Ulster, Meath, Leinster, and Munster. The leading dynasties are the northern and southern branches of the Uí Néill, descended from Niall of the 9 hostages, and his sons Ogan and Conall, along with their various descendant kindreds. In the Scottish lands, Argyll, Strathclyde, and the Lowland zone, as far as Withorn and Cumbria, form the stage. On the British side, the actors include the family of Seren and his son, Lugh, or Lugaid, rulers in the north, together with later descendants of mac Urca, who are portrayed as kings in Northumbria and in wider Britain. All of these threads combine to create the portrait of a figure who moves between history and legend, whose name is scattered across Ogham stones, annalistic notes, and heroic tales, and whose memory would later be reshaped in the light of both Irish political ambitions and the growing Arthurian imagination. Saran, son of Colchu and Lord of Britain, ruled not only his own island, but also influenced Picts and Saxons. He was intended to marry Urc, daughter of Lorn Mór mac Urca, ruler in the northern lands of Alba, and one who, according to tradition, received the blessing of Patrick together with his brothers Fergus and Angus. Yet, before her arranged marriage took place, Muirchertach's father, Muirchertach, grandson of Niall, fell deeply in love with the princess. The two fled together across the sea to Ireland, and there became parents to 4 sons, Muirchertach, Feradach, Tigernach, and Moan. King Saran, deprived of his promised bride, took instead her sister, Babona. From this union came many children, most notably Lugaid, Caernach, and others who would later shape both church and dynasty. Saran ruled Britain for a decade before withdrawing from royal life, spending his final days in devotion at Whitehorn, where his son Caernach later became bishop. A poem remembers Urk as mother of mighty sons born of 2 different marriages. The first 4 were fathered in Ireland by Muirchertach. After Muirchertach's death, Aersi married again, this time to Fergus, son of Conall Gulban, and bore more children, including Fedlim, ancestor of Columba, as well as Sedna, Brendan, and another Lorne. In her old age, she sought absolution. She walked ridge after ridge from Tory Island to Ross Ailey to confess to Caernach, her knees opened and bleeding. Seeing her devotion, he promised her heavenly reward, and foretold that kings of Ireland would descend from her line. When she died, her lands at Drumleen, along with wealth and livestock, passed to Caernach, and her sons continued the tribute she required of them even after the bishop's death. Muirchertach himself was blessed in childhood by Bishop Urk of Slane. Some later generations believed this blessing is what gave him the name Mac Urca, child of heaven, or perhaps one marked by the sky. In boyhood, he spent years under the care of the druid Saigan, and later under his father Muirchertach, king in the northern stronghold of Ailech. In time, after Saran's abdication, Lugaid came to rule Dal Araide, Strathclyde, and Britain, and stretched his command over Saxon territories. His arrogance angered the bishop Caernach, for he built a fort within church land and showed little regard for sacred boundaries. Meanwhile, Muirchertach rose in Ireland, ruling from Ailech and joining forces with Lugaid for military campaigns. Together with other war leaders, they defeated Oilil Molt in the Battle of Ocha. Soon after, Muirchertach again fought beside his kinsman at Grana, where Finchad fell. The following year, Sel Osnaid saw further bloodshed. Angus of Munster and his queen Aithne were killed, and the victory gave Muirchertach increased power among the Uí Nail. With strength came pride. He later slew church poets who mocked him, and for this sacrilege he was driven from Ireland. He sought refuge in Alba, but after 2 years turned violently upon King Lorne, burning him alive. His exile continued as he moved into Strathclyde under King Lugaid. There he learned advanced arts of war, and when his weapons were to be consecrated, Bishop Caernach himself arrived. The bishop, angered by Lugaid's earlier defiance, urged Muirchertach to destroy the king. During a hunt, a wild fawn ran through the host, taken by many as a sign. Muirchertach struck Lugaid down with his spear, severed the head, and brought it before Caernach as proof. From that moment, he and the bishop ruled Britain side by side. Muirchertach then waged war far afield. He gained victory over Franks and took as wife a daughter of their king. From that union, tales claimed he fathered Constantine, ancestral to rulers of Britain and of Cornwall, and other sons who became stems of later dynasties. For 7 years he held authority over Britain, Saxony, Picts, Northern Isles, and even Denmark. He spoke proudly of his conquests. He recalled years of fighting across seas, of driving out nobles, of nights filled with fallen kings, years spent winning Ireland, years ruling in Alba and Denmark, years of triumph without fear. His reward came when, after long conflict, the Frankish monarch fell and Muirchertach's authority widened. Caernach convened a grand council of bishops to bring unity and restore religious order across kingdoms. Afterward, he traveled again to Brittany, then to Cornwall, founding a settlement said to lie beneath the earth. Stories remembered him as first bishop of the northern Uí Néill, first martyr of the Irish, the earliest judge of Ireland's nobles. Even when Saxons and Franks rose again, Muirchertach crushed them, and after 7 troubled years returned to Ireland with a fleet, landing at Fan-na-Long. Resistance collapsed. He was hailed as High King and sovereign over Ireland, Britain, and the lands beyond. For a decade, tribute was paid in peace, until Leinster refused the cattle tax, and war ignited. At Detney, their king Ardgal fell beneath Muirchertach's army. For years afterward, Ireland remained quiet, until revolt stirred again. Battles followed at Sen Eich, at Athsaig beside the Boyne, and at Eblin, where he prevailed once more, winning the hostages of Leinster and Munster. His greatest victories secured tribute and obedience for the remainder of his reign. At last he called a great assembly at Dún Turlaim, where he settled the order of succession among Uí Néill lineages. The right of first voice he granted to Cuin, son of Ailill, son of Eugen, son of Niall, and declared that his descendants would hold priority in burial among the kings of Erin. He gave this honor because Cuin had marched with him into Munster and stood by him in war. Thus ended the judgment of the High King, Muirchertach mac Urcha, warmaker, breaker of kingdoms, conqueror within legend and history alike. Mac Urcha, for all his ferocity in war, was remembered as no pagan. Tradition insists that he ruled without needless cruelty or treachery, that he checked powerful armies and stood as one of the 2 great champions of his age, the other being the Eastern Emperor Justinian. Some later tellers tried to soften his end by saying he died quietly in his bed. Other stories, older and darker, insist that his death was violent, and that with his fall, the strength of Britain and its allies was broken. In these older tales, Muirchertach mac Urcha is King of Ireland, living in the great hall of Cletick, above the bend of the Boyne, near the sacred plain of Brugg. His wife is Duinsec, daughter of Duach of Connaught. One day he rides out with his hunters toward the edge of the Brugg, and, as often happens in heroic stories, his companions drift away until he finds himself alone on a hunting mound. There he sees a young woman sitting on the grass, bright-haired, pale-skinned, wrapped in a green cloak, more beautiful and refined than any woman he has ever seen. Love seizes him at once so strongly that he feels he would give the entire island for a single night with her. He greets her as though she were already known, and asks who she is. She tells him she is the beloved of Muirchertach mac Urcha, and has come looking for him. She declares that she knows him and all the men of Ireland, because hidden places and secret knowledge are familiar to her. He urges her to stay with him, and offers rich gifts, herds, gold, drinking horns, feasts in Cletick. She refuses ordinary payment. What she demands instead is more dangerous, that he must never speak her true name, that Duinsec and the children must never be in her presence, and that no cleric must ever enter any house where she stays. He agrees and swears to it, admitting that it would be easier to give away half of Ireland than to keep such conditions. But desire overcomes caution. When he asks her name so he can avoid it, she gives him a set of ominous words bound up with sighing wind, roaring storm, winter night, and lament, and warns that to utter them will bring his own death. Muirchertach brings the stranger back to Celtic. The hall is described as the finest in Ireland, raised over the salmon-rich Boyne, bright with trophies and full of the nobles of the clan of Niall eating the tribute of every province. The woman praises the house, the glory of the Uine, and even Duinsech's beauty and suitability as queen, as if to lull suspicion. Then she asks that Duinsech and her children be sent out, and that every master of a craft in Ireland should come with his wife into the great drinking hall. This is done. Craftsmen and nobles crowd the benches, and each boasts of his art in song. Kingship, music, agriculture, metalwork, battle, and every skill are praised as pleasant and honorable, and all agree that life under Muirchertach in the richly furnished hall of Celtic is sweet. When the feasting finishes, the woman claims the house as promised. She drives out Duinsech, the clan of Niall, and all the household, sending them away in 2 great companies of men and women. Duinsech takes her children to Tuilin to seek the help of Bishop Camelot. She confesses her fear, says that a woman of the other world has appeared, and that she feels powerless against her. Camelot comforts her, promises heavenly reward, and declares that the journey she has made in penitence will not need to be repeated. He foretells that she will one day prevail over the fortress, and that her fate will be good. Duinsech thanks both Christ and the saint. Camelot then goes to the descendants of Eogan and Conall and leads them back toward Celtic, but the mysterious woman refuses to let them approach. The clan of Niall stand outside in distress, unable to enter their own hall. The bishop's anger rises. He curses the fortress, marks out a grave near it, and says that the man for whom this grave is dug has reached the end of his kingship. He calls down misfortune and barrenness on the hill and on the house of Celtic, wishing that no king or prince will ever again prosper there. At the same time, he blesses a portion of ground for future holiness, and then turns to the kin of Eogan and Conall. He bestows on them a sweeping grant. Even when they do not hold the high kingship, they are to dominate the provinces around them. The succession of Ailech, Tara, and Ulster is to be theirs by right. They are not to stand as hostages for others. Victory will follow them in just battles, and 3 great relics will be their battle standards: the Cathach, Patrick's Bell, and Caernach's own reliquary. The blessings promise unbroken sovereignty, fame in war and prosperity, so long as they uphold justice. Then each group returns to its own homeland and stronghold. On his way back to his monastery, Caernach is met by large companies of the descendants of Taj, son of Cian, who ask him to help negotiate a settlement between their people and Muirchertach. The bishop goes with them. When the king sees Caernach among their number, shame reddens his face. He asks why the cleric has come after cursing him. Caernach replies that he is there to make peace between the kin of Taj and the kin of Ogan mac Nail. A treaty is forged. The saint lists the various lineages involved and unites them under a shared agreement. He mingles their blood in a single vessel as a sign of binding alliance and records the pact. He pronounces a curse on anyone who intentionally breaks it, wishing short life and damnation on the offender. Only then does he return to his monastery, leaving Muirchertach and his guests in the stronghold. Muirchertach resumes his place on the royal throne at Celtic, with the mysterious woman at his right hand, more dazzling than any other in form and face. He questions her about the source of her power and her origin. she answers that she believes in the same true God as the clerics, yet possesses her own mighty arts. She claims that nothing the churchmen can perform is beyond her own magic. She boasts that she could summon sun and moon, shape fighting men from nothing, turn rivers to wine, stones to sheep, fern to swine, and create silver and gold in front of assembled hosts. The king urges her to demonstrate. She steps outside and conjures two vast, evenly matched armies on the green, battle lines of warriors clashing, cutting one another down in showers of blood. To everyone watching, they seem completely real. Muirchertach snatches up his weapons, plunges in among them like a maddened bull, and slaughters them from morning until night. Yet every fallen warrior rises again behind his back. By evening, he is exhausted and filled with wonder at the spectacle. Back in the hall, the woman has water from the Boyne poured into great casks and enchants it until it tastes like the strongest, sweetest wine. She takes fern and turns it into enchanted pig flesh. The king and his followers gorge themselves, believing they eat and drink until satisfied, and she promises that she will supply such food and drink for them forever. The next morning, however, Muirchertach wakes feeling strangely drained. Everyone who shared that feast feels the same numb weakness. He complains that his strength has left him and that his burial can almost be sensed. She tells him the wine has consumed his body's power, but claims it does no harm to his soul. Yet he remains bound to her, convinced that she is the partner destined for him. At the king's request, she works another wonder. This time she shapes new phantom hosts from stones, some appearing as blue men, others as figures with the heads of goats, until 4 full battalions stand armed on the grass. Again, Muirchertach's rage is stirred. He attacks them, hacking through ranks of stone-born warriors all day long. Every figure he fells stands again. He marvels that those he has struck down still rise in the foaming water and on the field, and feels his own strength fading. The woman tells him that his reign has reached its limit, and that the power of these blue and goat-headed hosts outweighs his own. The king protests that this is not a true battle, since he is cutting only heather, turf, and stone, but continues to fight under her spell. Seeing his danger, Cairnach sends 3 clerics, Masan, Cassan, and Credan, to seek him, knowing through spiritual insight that the king is oppressed by enchantment. They find Muirchertach in the brug, laboring furiously, swinging his sword at stones and sods that he imagines to be living foes. They ask why he is cutting down lifeless rock, and tell him they grieve to see him weakened by the spells of an idol-working woman. They urge him to trace the sign of Christ's cross over his eyes. He obeys, and at once the illusions vanish. Only stones, earth, and plant stalks remain. When they tell him they have come to meet his corpse because death is near, he accepts the truth, entrusts his body to them, and begs that they carry him to Cairnach at Tualan. They promise to bear his body there, and not to leave him to the torments of hell, calling on the saints of Ireland as witnesses. He asks forgiveness of the heavenly king with all his heart, and places himself under the cleric's protection. The clerics then mark out a church on the green of the brug, and instruct Muirchertach to dig the trench for its foundation as an act of penance to the Lord of all elements. He agrees and begins cutting into the turf, damaging for the first time the untouched grass of the sacred plain. As he digs, he recounts the story of his life to them and pours out his repentance. He recalls 11 early years of wandering struggle, Years when almost every night someone from Leinster or Munster died by his campaigns. He remembers 20 years under the kingship of Eugen's line, with knightly heads taken from Ulster and Connaught, 25 years as High King over Ireland with constant killing, 2 years in Alba, during which he burned his own grandfather Lorne, 2 years ruling over Danes with heads raised on stakes each night. He admits that most of his days passed in strength without fear of death until now. After this confession, the clerics bless water, give him the sacrament, and hear his fervent repentance. He asks them to tell Cairnach exactly how he has repented. He reflects on the terror of hell, the cold narrowness of the grave, the end of tribute and assemblies, and the way his glory now collapses into clay. They remain in the little church for the night, while the king returns to Celtic. Back in the hall, he tells the woman how the clerics came, made him sign the cross, and revealed that he had been striking only fern and stone. She warns him again not to trust churchmen, calling their chants foolish and their verses discordant, urging him instead to stay with her if he wants a life without treachery. He chooses her company yet again. For 7 nights, she brews enchanted wine for the king and his troops. On the 7th night, the Tuesday that leads into Wednesday after the feast of Samhain, the magic is strongest. The hosts drink deeply until they are completely overcome. A terrible wind rises. The king hears its long moan and calls it the sigh of winter night. The woman reveals that these words echo her own hidden names and tells him that they point toward his approaching end. She summons a great snowstorm. The noise of the blizzard is like the roar of battle, the flakes thick as spears in the dark. Muirchertach steps outside, rails at the storm, and then comes back to complain that there has never been a night as bad as this. She tells him that the cold of Celtic marks the shortening of his years, and again warns him not to speak her old names aloud, because they draw destruction toward him. After the feast, the warriors collapse where they lie. None of them has even the strength of a woman in labor. The king dreams in the heavy sleep that follows. He sees red fire, hosts of spirits, Cletash blazing around his head, shields discarded, weapons tangled, the clan of Niall suffering under a curtain of flames and sorcery. He wakes screaming, shaken to the core, and rises from his bed unable to rest. He goes out into the storm to the small church at the Brug, where the clerics sit around a little fire. He tells them his vision and admits that there is no strength left in him, that he could not defend his fortress even if foreign enemies attacked that night. The clerics instruct him again and share his dread of the wild weather. Returning to the hall, he remarks bitterly on how evil the storm feels for the clerics huddled outside in their camp, saying they dare not sleep because of the harshness of the night. The woman answers sharply when he inadvertently uses one of her names, accusing him of calling death to his lips and reminding him that if he speaks those names fully, his fate will close in at once. He asks her how many more enemies will fall by his hand and demands a clear answer. She tells him that no further foes will die beneath his sword, that his strength has truly reached its limit. She reminds him that many already lie in the dust because of his long campaigns, and that now he must pay the price. Muirchertach recognizes that the old prophecy is being fulfilled, the one that said his death would resemble that of Lorne, not in battle, but by fire. The woman tells him to lie down, promises to keep watch over him, and assures him that even if Tuathal Maelgarb, son of Cormac, leads an army against Cletac that night, the king should not fear, because what is destined will come regardless. Under that assurance, and under the weight of wine, enchantment, and exhaustion, Muirchertach finally lets sleep take him as the storm rages over Cletach and his last night begins. Muirchertach returned to his bed and asked the mysterious woman for a drink. She enchanted the wine with a spell of sleep, so that a single draught left him dulled, powerless, and drained of strength. He fell into a deep, heavy slumber, and in that sleep he saw a vision. He dreamed that he sailed out upon the sea in a ship. The vessel went down beneath the waves, and a clawed griffin swooped down upon him, seizing him and carrying him to its nest. Then both nest and bird were engulfed in flames, and the griffin perished alongside him in the fire. When he woke, the dream was sent to his foster brother, Dub Darin, son of the druid Sainyan, so that it might be interpreted. Dub Darin explained that the ship on the sea represented the kingship Muirchertach had steered through the world. The foundering of the ship signified the end of his life and reign. The taloned griffin was the woman who had captivated him, who was intoxicating him and keeping him in the house of Cletach, so that he would die there when it burned. The fact that the griffin fell and burned with him showed that she herself would also perish because of the fate prepared for him. Once more sin cast her charm and dragged him back into deep sleep. While the king lay unconscious, she began to arrange his destruction. She set spears and javelins of the assembled warriors so that they were braced around the doors with their points turned inward toward the hall. She filled the building and the approaches with phantom crowds and companies conjured by her sorcery, then returned to the bed as though nothing had changed. Muirchertach woke suddenly and told her that he had just seen a host of demons burning the house over his head and cutting down his followers at the doors. She dismissed it calmly as an illusion and urged him not to be afraid. As they spoke, the roar of fire rose outside, followed by the terrible shouting of unseen hosts circling the hall. Muirchertach asked who surrounded the house. Sin answered that Tuathal Maelgarb, son of Cormac Keeb, son of Niall of the 9 hostages, had come with his forces to take vengeance for the Battle of Grain. The king believed her and did not understand that no human army stood outside. The clamor came from the powers she had summoned. He leapt up to reach his weapons, called for his household, and found no one to answer. The woman stepped out of the house, and he rushed after her, blundering into a press of shapes that loomed before him like an enemy host. He forced his way through them and was driven back again to the bed. The illusions crashed outward in his mind, as though his people were fighting and falling, so that no one seemed to escape without wounds or burning. When he made yet another attempt to reach the doorway, the threshold and the whole front of the hall were choked with embers and sheets of flame. Fire wrapped the entrance and raced through the building so fiercely that no refuge remained. In desperation, the king climbed into a great wine vat, trying to hide his body from the flames by sinking himself in the liquid. He ducked under again and again until he drowned from going beneath the surface in fear of the fire. Then the burning roof and beams collapsed, the blaze struck his head, and about 5 feet of his body were charred, while the wine shielded the rest from the worst of the flames. At daybreak, the clerics Masan, Kassan, and Crichton came to seek him. They found his body, lifted it from the ruin, and carried it to the Boyne, where they washed him clean of ash and wine. Bishop Cairnach arrived and broke into solemn lament, declaring that Ireland had lost one of its greatest rulers. In his judgment, Muirchertach belonged beside Niall of the 9 hostages, Muirchertach, the 100-fighter, and Ugain Mór, as one of the 4 most eminent high kings who had gained authority over all Ireland without trickery and without usurping force. Cairnach then recounted the course of Muirchertach's life. 10 years fostered in the house of Sainian the Druid, who possessed great herds. 2 more years under his father Muirchertach, until they parted and Muirchertach was left grieving. A further 2 years in the household of Lorne in Alba before the fateful killing of that kinsman. After that came 30 years among the Britons, during which he brought Saxon and British peoples under his sway, and then 10 years more during which Saxons and Britons launched a great assault toward Ireland. He ruled 20 years as king in the northern part of Ireland in the patrimony of Muirchertach, son of Ogun, and finally 25 years as high king over all Ireland until his life was cut short. Cairnach had the body raised up and borne to Twylin for burial. On the way, Duinsech, wife of Muirchertach, met the clerics. Seeing the corpse of her husband, she gave a piercing lament, clapped her hands in grief, and leaned her back against an ancient tree at Annach-Ryle. So fierce was the sorrow in her chest that blood burst from her heart, and she died on the spot. The clerics laid her body beside the king's and dug her grave. Cairnach marked her as the noble wife of Muirchertach, daughter of the king of Connaught, mother of Fergus and Domhnall, and mourned that she too had been taken by death after 25 years as queen beside the high king. When the queen was buried, the king's grave was made near the church on the northern side, and Cairnach spoke again about Muirchertach's nature and fate. He declared that the grave of the king of Ailech at Twylin would be remembered as long as people walked the road of Assail, that Muirchertach had been towering in stature and unmatched in strength, that only part of his body lay there, the rest having been burned because the wine in the vat was too shallow to cover him completely, and that his lineage would never easily surrender hostages, for the descendants of the kings of Ailech would be feared throughout Ireland. He admitted that the sins of Muirchertach, committed even while under the shadow of the saints, had led to this end, and said he would never forget the place of his burial for as long as he lived. When the rites were done, the clerics saw a lone woman approaching them. She was tall, radiant, and richly dressed, with a green mantle edged in gold thread and a silk tunic beneath. Her beauty was striking, yet her face was full of sorrow. They greeted her, and she returned the greeting. From her expression and presence, they understood that she was the one whose actions had destroyed the king. Cairnach questioned her gently, asking who she was and what kin she came from, and why she had brought about the ruin of Muirchertach. She answered that her name was Sin, and that she was the daughter of Saig, son of Dian, son of Train. Her people were of the old tribes of Tara above the Boyne. In the battle at Serb on the Boyne, Muirchertach had slain her father, her mother, and her sister, had crushed her homeland, and broken those ancient families. It was for this reason that she had enticed him, intoxicated him, and led him to destruction. Cairnach spoke of her father as a warrior who excelled in cunning, whose speech could drive whole hosts into disaster, and whose battles had reddened the rivers of the land. He reminded her that love of a father can drive a child to terrible deeds, but that the measure of vengeance had now been filled. Sin confessed that she had poisoned Muirchertach, that she had danced and feasted with him for 3 months until he fell under her scorn and went to his death, and that she now felt broken with grief, both for the High King of the West and for her own guilt. She declared that she could not live after him, and asked that her soul be commended to heaven. Cairnach required a strict penance from her, but promised that through the mercy of God there could still be forgiveness. She made a fervent confession, submitted herself to his instruction, and died of sorrow soon afterward. The clerics washed her body and buried her in the earth as the bishop directed. He noted that her actions had not been dear to God or humankind, that her mocking words and destructive magic had brought lasting trouble, but that her family had not been without honor, and that her fierce revenge had now run its course. Finally, the story tells that Cairnach continued to care deeply for Muirchertach's soul, even though he could not by his own power bring it out of the torment that followed. He composed a long penitential prayer, beginning with the Latin words asking the Lord to spare the supplicant, and he recited it constantly on behalf of the dead king. An angel appeared to him and revealed that whoever faithfully recited that prayer would certainly reach heaven, saying that its power was so great it could, in principle, have helped even the most notorious of traitors. The angel also told him that Muirchertach, though his body had gone to the grave and his sins had weighed him down, was now lifted to the heights by the intercession of the saints and the prayers spoken on his behalf. Cairnach gave thanks to Christ and to the guardian angel, reflecting that it had been a grace in his lifetime to stand in the presence of such heavenly messengers. He measured his years, saying that a full 25 had passed since he had come from Rome to that place, up to the very night of these events. The tale closes by saying that the account of the death of Muirchertach mac Urca was preserved and retold by holy men such as Cairnach, Tigernach, Tíran, Mochta, and Tuathal Melgarb, written down and corrected so that it would be remembered among the people from their time onward. Taken as a whole, the saga of Mac Urca is a striking blend of heroic narrative, legendary history, and mythic ending. It mixes battles, alliances, royal feasts, and church politics with visions, curses, prophecies, and a dramatically staged threefold death by fire, water, and weapons. The material clearly stands apart from later Arthurian romances and belongs to an earlier stratum of storytelling. These Irish traditions circulated before the great Latin and French works about Arthur gained their final form, and may well go back to the period when the first Arthur tales were being written down in Wales. Whether Mac Urca's story and Arthur's legend grew up independently in related cultural worlds, or whether motifs traveled back and forth between Ireland, Britain, and the continent over the centuries, remains a question that would require a broader comparative study. Even from this single tale, certain parallels are hard to miss. Mac Urca lives and fights in the same general period as the historical Arthur is often placed. He is said to defeat the same kinds of enemies, notably Saxons and other foreign powers. He wields formidable weapons, enjoys the help and rivalry of powerful saints, and his fate is closely tied to a dangerous woman whose name, when translated and shifted into the Welsh world, can be made to echo that of Arthur's queen. His own epithet, Mac Urca, can be interpreted in ways that connect it to imagery of brightness, speckling, and heavenly signs, not far from some of the symbolic readings that cluster around Arthur's name in later commentary. From an Irish perspective, Mac Urca looks very much like the champion figure who occupies the same imaginative space as Arthur did for the Britons. At the same time, the Irish tradition anchors him more firmly in recognizable politics than Geoffrey of Monmouth's great romance of Arthur would later do. Mac Urca is linked to a real Frankish king in Clovis, rather than a shadowy Lucius. He is made to marry a daughter of the Frankish ruler and to Father Constantine, presented as ancestor of later British kings. Another son, Baden, carries a name that echoes the famous Battle of Baden, the decisive victory of the Britons over the Saxons. Whether this allusion signals a remembrance of a child named in honor of that battle, or reflects a later reshaping of traditions, is difficult to prove, but it is suggestive. The identity of Mac Yrca himself is also debated. Some scholars see him as the same person as Muirchertach mac Muirchertach, a king known from Irish annals, while others argue that the name Muirchertach may be a later form and that the legendary Mac Yrca could originally have been a different figure. There is also the possibility that he began as a Brittonic or mixed heritage hero, later absorbed into Wee Nail genealogies, in much the same way that saints like Ninian were adopted into multiple Irish family lines. What can be said with some confidence is that in these stories the Irish world fashioned its own great war leader whose life, battles, and mysterious end run in parallel to the better-known Arthur, offering a native champion to stand beside the British one in the storytelling of the early medieval West. Mac Yrca is far from a phantom of legend. His name appears in early Irish memory, with enough weight to mark him as a real figure. Adamnan refers to him in the late 7th century. The Béal Chuin preserves him earlier still, likely in the first half of that century, and the annals record his name in an older form, Airse, further anchoring him in the historical record rather than in invention alone. The lingering question is whether this ruler could be the same war leader later celebrated among the Britons as Arthur. The possibility is not beyond reason. Over time, his name appears in multiple forms, in Ogham, in early Latin spellings, and in Irish expressions linked to sky or brightness, but more intriguingly, it may carry an association with the concept of the bear. Arthur, in Welsh, translates directly to bear. If Irk developed naturally into earth, a form which also aligns with the Welsh term for bear, then Mac Yrca could plausibly fit into the role of an Arthur-type figure, not merely a king of the Irish North, but a champion remembered across the Irish Sea. A broader study may one day take up the unresolved questions: how the traditions of Britain and Ireland may have intertwined, whether Arthur was one man remembered in two lands, or two men shaped into one shadow, and how these memories shift through language, poetry, conquest, and belief. For now, the idea stands open. Ireland preserved its own great war leader, moving through the same era, fighting the same enemies, earning victories that echo those attributed to the Arthur of Wales. In that sense, Mac Yrca may well be seen as the Irish Arthur, equal in deeds, equal in time, and perhaps remembered under another name in another land.